Hi everyone. So today we've got a new author, and again I'm going to ask you to guess who the author is, and I'm going to give you a few hints so that you can guess as quickly as possible. So his date of birth: he was born in 1902 in America. And he was born in Salinas, California. When he was growing up, his mother, Olive, was very strict. She had a fierce code of honor and morality, which she passed on to her son. He was totally enamored as a child of the Camelot myth. And it had a huge impact on his later work, his writing. Particularly the story of treachery, of Lancelot's treachery, and also the Mallorean myth of the good man, the search for the one good man. Right, this idea that a good man is hard to find. So this motif of treachery and the search for the good man it undergirds most of his work, actually, right to the end of his career. Now, he was a rather good student in high school, but when he got to university, he went to Stanford University, which is a very prestigious university, but he didn't work much as a student. He used to read outside the syllabus rather than the books on the syllabus. And as he was rather hard up, he had to work for a living instead of studying. So he eventually dropped out without a degree. Much to his parents' chagrin. And so he used to spend his time on plantations working as a farm hand, and he would meet migrants there, Mexican migrants mostly, and he spoke to them a lot, was always very much in tune with the common man throughout his life. That's one of the major motifs in his work, one of his major interests. And he used to pay them $50 or $1 for their stories, just like his literary forebear Jack London. And so he saw himself as a bit of a literary magpie, stealing other people's stories, which nowadays is frowned upon. But back then wasn't frowned upon as much. Shakespeare used to do it. The vast majority of Shakespeare's plays tend to be taken from stories that already existed, either plays or folk tales, or just stories that people knew. He also unearthed stories that weren't as well known. Most critics agree that borrowing is in literature is just intertextuality, really. As long as you modify what you take, it's called fair use in the arts. You're allowed to take an image also in the visual arts and modify it, as long as it's quite substantially modified, then, well, you're just borrowing a kind of structure, really. So he tended to borrow. Scott Fitzgerald didn't like his borrowing, even though Scott Fitzgerald was himself quite a bit of a literary magpie too. He pointed out that a lot of what Steinbeck used was already present in works such as McTeague by Frank Norris. So once he left Stanford, he went on to be a writer, he was pretty penniless, so he couldn't afford to go to Europe the way Fitzgerald and Hemingway did. So he just couldn't afford the fare. So he stayed in America. He very much wanted to go to Europe. He loved Europe, and when he was richer later, he did travel there quite extensively, especially to England, where his beloved Camelot myth was born. So he stayed in America and, well, made the most of that, and later said that he was happy that he hadn't gone to Europe because it made him concentrate more on America and the themes that interested him the most. He later left California, which was considered the land of milk and honey in those days. He left it for reasons that are linked to his work. He published a book that was very controversial in California. If I tell you the name of the book, you'll realize who the author is straight away. Anyway, he left California for New York, and even just going to New York uprooted him from what he knew best, and some critics have argued that it hurt his writing, and that he was never the same again as a writer once he left California for good. So now his first work was called The Cup of Gold, and it's about a buccaneer, a pirate from the 17th century. It didn't get him much acclaim, which is the reason why you've never heard of it. And he became famous almost overnight when he published Tortilla Flat. Tortilla Flat is a novel inspired by his time as a migrant worker, as an itinerant worker. And so it focuses mostly on paisanos, the paisanos that he met in California, these Mexican itinerant migrant workers. And it garnered him quite a lot of success. And from that time onwards, he was widely publicized and sold extremely well. Now, so his first novels tend to show you poverty in a slightly comic or at least light-hearted way, and he's been criticized for that because, well, it's seen as not politically correct to treat poverty in a comic light. Now, more recent critics have tried to reconcile this lightness of tone with his later work in the Depression era in the 1930s, where he depicts poverty in a much harsher light. Well, also the Great Depression was having a huge impact in that time. So it's logical that he treated it with more gravitas in the 30s. So you'll have guessed by now who I'm talking about. If you haven't, I'll just mention his first novel, which is Of Mice and Men. Right now everybody knows who I'm talking about. So Of Mice and Men, about two itinerant workers searching for a home of sorts, which they never find, so a rather pessimistic work. You have, of course, his magnum opus, The Grapes of Wrath, about the Dust Bowl in the Middle West, and you have the migration of Okies, as they were called, people from Oklahoma. But people from all the Middle West were called Okies, even though a lot of them weren't from Oklahoma, and they were treated very badly. Right. So this is his novel about this family that goes west during the crisis, the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, which affected the Middle West, and their plight as they travel across to California. It's based on the biblical story of Exodus. So he gives it this very sort of minor focus on one family. He gives it a kind of biblical scope by comparing it to the Exodus of the Jews from Egypt to Israel, the Promised Land. And California turns out not to be the Promised Land at all, because, well, the migrant workers are treated extremely badly when they get there, and people, even the workers in California, didn't want them because it drove wages down. Wages were actually cut by 2/3 on the lettuce plants, and so they were forced to work at gunpoint. Because people were threatening to go on strike, and so it caused a lot of resentment, as you can imagine, among the Californian workers, and they tended to depict Okies as lazy and immoral, right? Which is usually the way migrants are treated and seen. So this was a major landmark for him. It's a novel that started out as a series of essays, and Steinbeck tended to be interested in nonfiction. He, was in some ways a kind of a journalist and who wrote semi-documentary novels. So it started off as a group of essays and eventually became a full-blown novel. He had an interest in politics and was very much a writer who wrote about contemporary issues. So in that respect, you can say he's a modernist, in that he dealt with modern issues, and also was keen to show having a modern approach to the body, for example. So one of the major themes of the modernists, and his famous last scene where Rose of Sharon, who is lactating, gives her breast to an old man. Well, he's actually not that old, but around my age actually. But anyway, so he, that picture, that image, shocked Californians and people from Oakland as well. It was banned and burned in front of the library in Salinas, California, and also mistreated by people in Oklahoma. So after he returned to California, we used to travel a little around America. He was seen as a persona non grata. So people, refused to read his books. They, even the gas board, refused to send gas to his house. So he left California for New York and never came back. Now his slightly later novels, also famous, Cannery Row, was published in 1945. So his novels in the 40s are also maybe not quite as depressing, some of them. Cannery Row ends relatively well, and it's one of his more upbeat novels. And it's modernist in the sense that it doesn't have much of a plot. It's just often a series of anecdotes and vignettes and people talking to each other about stories. And the main plot is just basically getting hunting for frogs and getting drunk. So that plotlessness is a modernist feature, which he integrated. Now, he's generally not seen as a modernist writer because on a formal level, he didn't use the radical experimentation of, say, Faulkner with multiple viewpoints and limited, unreliable narrators, things like that. So you could say he's a bit of a conservative modernist, at least on a formal level. Though he did use a mythopoeic approach, like T.S. Eliot. He used myth. T.S. Eliot was, in favor of what he called the mythic method rather than the narrative method, where stories followed myths or created mythical moments. My favorite novel is The Pearl. This is my mother's copy, actually, and like me, she loved it so much that she actually took a bite out of it, as you can see here. No, I'm actually messing. She got this from her cousin Ivar Wallmark. I really like battered novels, novels that have been through a lot, novels that practically been through a war. The Pearl is an exceptional novel. It's just so exciting, thrilling, gripping, and you really get attached to the characters. This is the one I would recommend if you were to read any novel by John Steinbeck. So I'm going to introduce you to our novelist. So John is here to give you a little talk and introduce himself. So I'd like you to welcome our next host, John Steinbeck. So John, would you care to enter the limelight and talk to our spectators today? Yeah, and thanks. And okay, so John, I hope you're doing well. Thanks for coming to the show. You're welcome. So we're going to be talking about your work as a modernist. I've called you a conservative modernist. I hope you don't mind that. Sure, no problem. I tended to be more interested in writers like Turgenev, the Russian writer, rather than, say, Proust and Joyce when I was a student. I'm interested in the storytelling novelists like Jack London. He was one of my favorites back in those days. So basically, I'm not a modernist in that I do feel you got to tell a good story, and you gotta convey a kind of message and show an interest in the people. My thought is that I'm not so much of a modernist, because modernists were more interested in the individual as an exceptional being apart from the crowd. A lot of modernists were rather elitist. They tended to place themselves above the masses. They hated the masses. Whereas I always felt comfortable talking to the ordinary people, and in fact I preferred talking to ordinary people. I often found parties, in high society, a bit of a strain, being shy and all. It embarrassed me. I never really liked that much. So yeah, I'm gonna talk to you about my novels a little bit. So, well, the one that I'm remembered most for, of course, is my novel, The Grapes of Wrath. My wife Carol found the title for that. So it's taken from the Bible. So yeah, it was, I was quite frightened actually when it came out, because the FBI had been investigating me as a communist. I was seen as a communist, even though in those days a communist was often just someone who wanted to be paid 25 cents an hour instead of what the landowners were offering, which would have been around 20 cents cents an hour. So I did have communist sympathies, certainly, but I was never a full-blown member of the Communist Party. But I was definitely investigated, and there were rumors sent out about my novel just before it was published, which had an impact on the way I was perceived in those days. So now a lot has been said about my youth. I just like to set the record straight, because it's true I was an alcoholic, but in those days, people of my generation, in that period and of my class, tended to drink a lot. Writers, not just writers, but most people drank a lot. It was just part of socializing, and just people just drank. And my whoring, well, I did a little bit of that, but mostly I exaggerated it. I was into self-mythologizing. I've always been a bit of a liar. So I did do some whoring, but most people did back in those days. James Joyce, all those people, they did go whoring, right? It was part of being a writer, was experiencing life as fully as you could, right? So you needed to investigate things. So going to see a prostitute was like doing documentary work in some ways. So yeah, I mean, the main thing I'd like to point out about myself is that I've always been a scientist at heart. My friend Ed Ricketts, who was a marine biologist, he really had a huge impact on the way I perceived people, and so he taught me the theory of group behavior. Ed Ricketts, he was actually a central character in 6 of my novellas, and he introduced me to the concept of the Phalanx. Now, the Phalanx concept is the study of the individual within a group. So I gave a kind of ecological perspective of people, how they fit into a group, how they work within a group, how they're influenced by the group, and so just the way you might study marine specimens. And I've always been fascinated by the sea and everything that grows in it, and so I tended to approach human beings the way maybe naturalists did, in a less, I think, racist manner than a lot of the 19th century naturalists. I didn't go in for stereotyping, I hope. I've been accused of anti-Semitism a little bit. Again, people of my generation tended to be anti-Semitic. It was just in the air. You have people, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound were the worst of them. But Scott Fitzgerald was also an anti-Semite. He changed the way I did. We grew to see the error of our ways. And I've been known to. I actually wrote once that commercial writers were the Jews of literature. That's something I regret having said, of course. It was just ignorant. So now that I've set the record straight, let me tell you a little bit about my other works. So I tended to start with quasi-allegorical tales, especially in my early work, but later as well I turned to allegory. That goes back to my interest in Malory and the Camelot myth. And I'm mostly famous for my social realism and my protest novels of the Depression era. And mostly critics prefer that. They prefer my social realism, which I think is a bit unfair. Now, just to give you the context again, so in the 30s, my semi-documentary novels, these political fictions that I wrote, they were influenced by writers like Sherwood Anderson, Upton Sinclair, and Theodore Dreiser, who all had an interest in documentary reporting. So that was just part of the spirit of the 30s, really, I guess. That radicalism that was there in the 30s would have peaked around the 1930s, middle of the 1930s, and it kind of dwindled towards the end of the 30s, especially after the infamous Moscow show trials of 1937, and the Nazi-Soviet pact, of course, killed off a lot of interest across the world in communism. That was seen as a great treason, a great betrayal of communist ideals. So I always felt that it was the writer's duty to bear witness. The early part of my life was poisoned by egotism, but I quickly grew to see the error of my ways and took an interest in the plight of the Okies as they came, from the Bible Belt over to California. I felt personally implicated in their predicament. Now this fear of revolution in the 30s was very widespread, and I was investigated, as Eric said, by the FBI, and I was pretty scared for my life, actually. I received numerous death threats. And but in the end, the revolution never occurred the way it did in Russia, probably because of F.D. Roosevelt and his New Deal. He created a kind of welfare state that gave the impression, at least, that the government actually cared about its citizens, and so. I think possibly my novel did have some impact. In those days, at least, people did believe that a novel could change life, not the way you see it, you folks see it in these days. So my Grapes of Wrath was seen as a protest book on a par with Uncle Tom's Cabin. It really roused people to fight against intolerable wrongs. I did really believe that in those days. There was this fascination for the notion of the great American novel, and I tried to create that in the Grapes of Wrath and later in my other big novel, East of Eden. Especially in the post-war era, when it was important to show that America was as great as Russia. this fascination with the great American novel was something that drove me, I must confess. So, well, I hope I've told you enough about my novels for you to understand what I was interested in. So I think that perhaps we should call it a day. So long. Bye, folks.